This is one of the secrets of cell phones. They are always tested in a holster. They are never tested in the pocket.
If phones were tested in pockets, they would exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines.
Dr. Davis, you said that a cell phone should not be kept any closer than an inch to your body. Is that what you said? I don't know where does that come from?
That actually comes from the BlackBerry manual as well as from the iPhone manual. If you read the manuals, which almost none of us does, that is what they say. So by calling for warning labels as I am simply calling to codify what the industry is currently telling us about cell phones. And I would also add that when I was privileged to work with Dr. Ronald Herbermann at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, he looked at the evidence on this issue as one of the world's most distinguished cancer biologists, and he concluded that it was appropriate to warn the staff to take these simple precautions, the same precautions that Israel is recommending, the same precautions that Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have recommended.
Okay, now let's face it, us men, now my wife has a BlackBerry, she keeps it in her purse. It's fine. Mm-hmm. We all have these holsters, right? Every man, we all put them on our belts. Mm-hmm. Are you telling me that I should not wear a BlackBerry?
Well, actually,
that when millions of Americans put this phone up next to their ear, even if only for brief periods of time, there are millions of them that wonder whether or not they may be hurting their own health or their children's health. And when 110 million Americans are using cell phones, it doesn't take a very large error in terms of identification of adverse medical consequences to have an epidemic-size problem.
So the cell phone's here, is that right?
Correct.
Cell phone's here, and it's a very deep penetration, you're saying. Now, is this kind of penetration of the energy of a cell phone, the radio frequencies, radiation, we're saying, would you say that from looking at this visually, is it your testimony that most of the brain of a child would be would receive some of this energy?
That's correct. Most of the brain, at least on that side of the head, would be absorbing that energy, and it's a simple explanation for it. One is that the skull is considerably thinner in a child, and it doesn't reach maturity until the 20s. In addition to that, the nerves in the brain in an adult are protected by a myelin sheath. In children, the myelin has not fully developed, so there's several reasons for the increased absorption in a child.
What are the considerations with respect to an additional potential risk for children using cell phones?
Children have a configuration of their skull that does allow penetration of cell phone radiation deeper.
Are you saying there's a potentially greater risk?
And in all of these, we're finding that levels can be quite high, much higher in the younger brain, which has more fluid and a softer skull. There's clearly a higher exposure. And even if the exposures were identical to the child and the adult, the child is not just a little adult. Their brains are less myelinated, they're growing more rapidly, and they need more protection. That's why we put helmets on them. That's why we put them in special car seats until they reach a certain weight. Children need more protection than adults, and our standards do not take that into account. Probably the most important thing I did, I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
A growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program in a classic large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, and for that matter, one of the most expensive. they found increased risk of the tumors which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC. The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I've never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
At this point, the evidence has become sufficiently strong that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen.
A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. You know, I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting.
The American Academy of Pediatrics in over a dozen countries recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this.
To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children.
When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless.
Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them.
Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures.